A policeman detains a black girl with expensive purchases, deciding that she couldn't afford them honestly. He's sure he's in control of the situation, until her mother arrives on the scene, whose arrival turns everything upside down. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Don't miss new stories. It was a perfect day. The sun hovered gently in the sky above the pristine streets of a luxury shopping district, casting a warm golden hue on the gleaming glass windows of high-end boutiques. A light breeze carried the fragrance of fresh flowers from the nearby planters and the subtle scent of roasted coffee from the outdoor cafes. Pedestrians, most dressed in designer clothes, moved at a leisurely pace, chatting or admiring the latest fashion displays. This was a place where wealth was expected, a place where every storefront, every cobblestone street, and every step radiated privilege. Aaliyah Walker, just 14 years old, walked among them carrying shopping bags filled with her latest purchases. Her stride was light, her head held high. She wore a confident smile, not just from the weight of the bags in her hands, but from what they represented, a reward. These were gifts from her mother, Melissa Walker, the captain of the city's police force. After months of hard work at school, Aaliyah had earned every single item in those bags. Top grades, leadership in her school club, and endless hours of homework had all culminated in this: a day off in the wealthiest part of the city, with her mother's blessing to buy whatever she wanted. Her mother's voice echoed in Aaliyah's mind. "You earned this, baby. Take the day, have fun, and know I'm proud of you." The words made Aaliyah's chest swell with pride. She had grown up watching her mother break through barriers, rising in a profession where few women, especially black women, held positions of authority. Melissa Walker was known throughout the city for her unflinching dedication to justice. She fought not just for herself, but for every marginalized voice drowned out by the noise of the privileged. Aaliyah admired her mother deeply, aspiring to embody that same strength. Today was a celebration of that hard work. Aaliyah glanced down at the bags in her hands, sleek, glossy bags from her favorite stores, filled with clothes and accessories she had picked out carefully, each item a reflection of her personality. She had tried on dozens of outfits, relishing in the joy of finding things that felt just right. Every purchase was more than just a possession. It was a reminder that she belonged in the spaces like these, just as much as anyone else. As she walked down the street, she noticed the occasional glance from passers-by. She felt their eyes linger a second longer than usual, a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Aaliyah had experienced moments like these before, brief flashes of judgment, invisible but heavy. She brushed it off as her mother had taught her to do. "Their stares mean nothing," her mother would say. "What matters is what you think of yourself." Aaliyah adjusted her grip on the bags and continued walking. She passed by a jewelry store with a glittering display of gold watches and diamond necklaces. A couple in their mid-30s, both dressed in sleek business attire, stood nearby chatting. As Aaliyah passed them, she noticed the woman giving her a quick, appraising glance. It was subtle, but Aaliyah felt it. There was that familiar flicker of judgment, the kind that asked, "What's she doing here?" But Aaliyah ignored it. She had every right to be here. "This is my day," she thought. "No one's taken that from me." She checked her phone to see if her mother had messaged her. No new texts, but that was expected. Melissa had told her to enjoy the day and not worry about time. They would meet for dinner later at a nearby restaurant. Aaliyah smiled at the thought. She couldn't wait to tell her mother about everything she had bought. The street was alive with the sounds of luxury, the gentle clinking of coffee cups, the low hum of expensive cars, the occasional polite laughter from passers-by. Aaliyah felt at peace here. She belonged, or at least she thought she did. As she neared the next intersection, she saw a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street. The sight didn't bother her. After all, her mother was a police captain. Cops were supposed to protect people, to ensure safety. It was a thought ingrained in her from years of hearing her mother's stories about fighting for justice and holding the force accountable. Aaliyah knew the challenges her mother faced, knew that being a black woman in law enforcement came with constant battles, both within the system and outside it. But today, none of that mattered. Today was a perfect day. But when she finally found the small stack of papers and began to pull them out, the officer took a sudden step forward, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Slow down," he barked, and Aaliyah froze. His hand hovered near his holster, the movement subtle but unmistakable. She quickly withdrew her hand from her purse, holding it up in front of her to show she wasn't doing anything threatening. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Why was he acting like this? Why was he treating her like a criminal? "I'm just getting the receipts," Aaliyah said, her voice trembling now. "They're right here." "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer snapped. His voice was harder now, colder. Aaliyah felt a wave of panic wash over her. She could barely breathe, her body stiff with fear. She couldn't understand how a simple shopping trip had turned into this. All she wanted was to prove she hadn't done anything wrong, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The officer took another step toward her. "You fit the description of a suspect in a recent theft in this area," he said flatly. "We need to make sure those items weren't stolen." "What?" Aaliyah's voice broke, the word barely escaping her throat. "I didn't steal anything. I bought these—" "Enough," the officer interrupted, cutting her off. "We'll figure it out at the station." Aaliyah's eyes widened in shock. The station? The word hit her like a punch in the gut. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. He was planning to take her in. Her mind raced as she tried to think of what to do, but her body felt frozen. The officer was already reaching for her wrist. "I didn't do anything wrong," she repeated, this time more forcefully. But the words fell on deaf ears. The officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with a roughness that made her gasp in pain. "Please," Aaliyah cried out. "I have the receipts. Just look at them." But the officer wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them onto her wrists with a sharp, metallic click. Aaliyah felt the cold metal bite into her skin, and suddenly the world around her became a blur. People were still walking by, some slowing down to watch, others pretending not to see. She wanted to scream for help, to beg someone to step in, but her voice was caught in her throat. Her chest felt tight, her vision cloudy. She had never felt so powerless. The officer began leading her toward the cruiser, his grip firm and unrelenting. Aaliyah's heart sank as she realized that no one was going to stop this. No one was going to save her from this nightmare. "Please," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't do anything." But the officer's only response was silence. As they neared the cruiser, something jolted her out of her daze, the sound of a phone hitting the pavement. She turned her head just in time to see her phone lying on the sidewalk, the screen still lit up. The video call with her mother hadn't ended. In the chaos of everything that had just happened, her phone had slipped from her hand, but it had stayed connected. Her mother. Aaliyah's heart raced with a new kind of panic. Her mother had seen everything. She had heard the officer's harsh words, seen the handcuffs, watched her daughter being dragged toward the police car. Suddenly, the weight of the situation crashed down on Aaliyah in full force. Her mother would never let this stand. Melissa Walker wasn't just anyone. She was the captain of the city's police force, and she was on her way. But as much as Aaliyah wanted to feel relief, a new fear crept in. She knew her mother was fiercely protective of her, but she also knew how complicated things could get when someone in law enforcement was involved. The officers here had no idea who her mother was, and Aaliyah wasn't sure if they even cared. The cruiser loomed in front of her, its door open, waiting to swallow her whole. The officer pushed her forward, and Aaliyah stumbled, her legs shaky from fear and adrenaline. She didn't want to get in that car. She couldn't. She had done nothing wrong, but they were treating her like she was guilty of something she didn't even understand. "Wait!" Aaliyah cried out, turning her head back toward the officer. "Please, my mom, she's—" "I said enough," the officer growled, cutting her off. His grip tightened on her arm, and before she could finish her sentence, he shoved her into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud, and for a moment, Aaliyah was left alone in the suffocating silence of the police car. Her body trembled uncontrollably, tears now streaming down her face. She felt trapped, not just by the metal and glass that surrounded her, but by the overwhelming weight of helplessness. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the cool glass of the window. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not like this. Outside the car, she saw the officer standing with his partner, both of them engaged in a quiet conversation, their expressions unreadable. She wondered what they were saying, but more than that, she wondered how long it would take for her mother to arrive. Her phone was still on the ground, its screen blinking as the video call remained connected. Aaliyah could only imagine what her mother was doing at that very moment, knowing that her daughter was being held by her own officers in her own city. It wasn't long before she heard the distant wail of a siren, louder and closer with every passing second. Her mother was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The shrill wail of the siren grew louder, cutting through the quiet hum of the shopping district. Aaliyah sat in the back of the police cruiser, her heart racing as the sound drew closer. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging up the surface as fear and adrenaline swirled inside her. Outside, the officers stood by the cruiser, their expressions guarded, unaware of the storm heading their way. Melissa Walker's black SUV sped through the narrow streets, the sirens blaring in sync with the flashing red and blue lights. The moment Aaliyah's call had connected, Melissa had left everything behind. Her meeting, her paperwork, her coffee still sitting half-finished on her desk. None of it mattered now. Her baby was in trouble. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. The rage and fear bubbling inside her felt overwhelming, but she forced herself to stay focused. She had dealt with dangerous situations before, as a cop, a captain, and a mother. But this was different. This was personal. Her mind raced as she approached the scene, replaying everything she had seen and heard through the FaceTime call. The officer's sharp voice, Aaliyah's trembling attempts to explain herself, and the click of handcuffs around her daughter's wrists. Melissa clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. She knew the weight of the badge she wore, and she knew how fragile situations like this could be. One wrong move, and everything could spiral further out of control. The moment Melissa's SUV screeched to a halt, Aaliyah spotted it from the back seat of the cruiser. Relief washed over her, but it was mixed with dread. She knew her mother well enough to know that this wasn't going to end quietly. The officers looked up as Melissa threw open her door and stepped out, her tall, commanding figure dressed in a dark, tailored suit. Her eyes were blazing with controlled fury as she marched toward the cruiser. The officer who had detained Aaliyah, Officer Owens, straightened, his hand still resting on the belt around his waist. His expression was unreadable, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his face as Melissa approached. He didn't yet realize who she was, and it showed in the way he folded his arms and gave her a hard, indifferent look. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Owens asked, his voice edged with impatience. Melissa's gaze flicked to Aaliyah, who sat in the back of the car, her small frame trembling with fear and humiliation. The sight of her daughter, handcuffed, scared, and treated like a criminal, sent a wave of cold fury surging through her. "I'm Captain Melissa Walker," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "And that's my daughter you've got in your cruiser." For a moment, the air between them froze. Owens blinked, and his partner shifted uneasily beside him. The realization hit them like a slap, but Owens didn't immediately back down. Years of unchecked authority and bias clouded his judgment, and instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. "Well, Captain Walker," Owens said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "your daughter was acting suspiciously. We're investigating a theft, and she matches the description of the suspect." Melissa's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. "What exactly did she do that was suspicious, officer?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Owens hesitated. "She was carrying bags from high-end stores," he said defensively, "and when I asked for her receipt, she got nervous." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "She got nervous because you treated her like a criminal from the moment you stopped her," she said, taking a step closer. "Let me guess. The description you mentioned? Black, young, carrying shopping bags." Owens opened his mouth to respond, but Melissa cut him off with a glare so sharp it could slice through steel. "You detained my daughter, put her in handcuffs, and were prepared to take her to the station, all without a shred of evidence. You didn't even let her show you the receipts." Her voice was calm, but beneath the surface it was filled with barely restrained rage. "That's racial profiling, officer, and not only is it wrong, it's illegal." Owens shifted uncomfortably, but his pride wouldn't let him admit fault. "Look, Captain, I'm just doing my job." "No," Melissa snapped, her voice cutting through his weak excuse. "Doing your job means protecting people, not harassing them based on the color of their skin." She glanced over at his partner, who stood silently, looking down at his boots. "And you," she said sharply, "you stood by and let this happen. Are you going to tell me you didn't see anything wrong with how your partner treated my daughter?" The younger officer squirmed under her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. I thought it was excessive," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Melissa turned back to Owens. "Excessive," she repeated slowly. "That's putting it lightly." Owens glared at his partner, clearly irritated by the lack of support. But before he could say anything, Melissa stepped forward, her presence commanding and unyielding. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice low and steady. "You're going to unlock that cruiser. You're going to take those cuffs off my daughter. And then you're going to give me a full explanation of why you thought this was appropriate." Owens hesitated, his jaw clenched in frustration. He was trapped, and he knew it. With a sharp breath, he pulled the keys from his belt and unlocked the cruiser door. The handcuffs clicked open, and Aaliyah stumbled slightly as her hands were freed. Melissa caught her daughter, pulling her into a protective embrace. "It's okay, baby," Melissa whispered, her voice soft now. "I've got you." Aaliyah buried her face in her mother's shoulder, tears spilling down her cheeks. For a moment, the two of them stood there, holding on to each other as if the rest of the world didn't exist. When Melissa finally pulled back, she cupped Aaliyah's face in her hands, brushing away the tears with her thumbs. "You're safe now," she whispered. Then she turned back to Owens, her expression hardening once more. "This isn't over," she said coldly. "I'm launching a full investigation into your conduct. And believe me, Officer Owens, when I'm done, you'll wish you'd handled this differently." Owens bristled, but he knew better than to argue. The younger officer shifted awkwardly beside him, clearly regretting his involvement in the entire situation. Melissa reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I've already called Internal Affairs," she said, holding up the device. "Expect a visit from them soon." Owens muttered something under his breath, but Melissa didn't care. She had bigger things to focus on, like making sure this never happened again, not just to Aaliyah, but to any other child who looked like her. She took Aaliyah's hand and guided her away from the cruiser, her heart still pounding with a mixture of relief and rage. As they walked, Aaliyah glanced up at her mother, her voice small but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. Melissa squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "Always, baby," she replied. "Always." The two of them walked away, leaving the stunned officers and the growing crowd behind them. But Melissa's mind was already racing, planning her next steps. This wasn't just about Aaliyah. This was about every child, every family, every person who had ever been treated unfairly because of the way they looked. And Melissa Walker wasn't going to stop until real change came, no matter what it took. The sound of Melissa's heels echoed sharply against the marble floors of police headquarters as she strode through the front lobby, her face set in an expression of cold determination. She had spent the entire night making phone calls, first to Internal Affairs, then to the mayor's office, and finally to the media contacts she'd cultivated over years of public service. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. Behind her, Aaliyah walked quietly, her hand still clasped in her mother's. The events of the previous day lingered in her mind like a storm cloud she couldn't shake. Her wrist ached slightly where the handcuffs had pinched her skin, but it was the emotional weight, shame, fear, and confusion that weighed her down the most. She glanced around nervously as officers in uniform moved through the halls. Some gave her sympathetic looks, while others avoided her gaze entirely. Melissa had insisted on bringing her daughter to the station that morning, not just to file an official complaint, but to make a statement. This was going to be public, and it was going to be thorough. The officers involved would be held accountable, and the department itself would have to reckon with the systemic issues that had allowed something like this to happen. "Sit tight, baby," Melissa whispered to Aaliyah as they entered a conference room. "This won't take long." Aaliyah gave a small nod, her eyes downcast. She had slept poorly the night before, her mind racing with questions. What if Mom hadn't shown up? What if no one had believed me? The thought that her safety depended on her mother's rank and influence left her feeling hollow. Melissa noticed the exhaustion etched on her daughter's face, but she had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to slow down now. Inside the room, 3 members of Internal Affairs were waiting. 2 older men in suits and a younger woman with a laptop open in front of her. They looked up as Melissa entered, their expressions carefully neutral. "Captain Walker," one of the men greeted her. "Please, have a seat." Melissa sat down across from them, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She didn't have time for pleasantries. "I assume you've reviewed the preliminary report I submitted last night." "We have," the younger woman confirmed, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "And we've begun gathering additional information from the officers involved." Melissa nodded sharply. "Good. Then you understand the gravity of this situation." There was a pause, brief but telling. Melissa could sense the hesitation, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Do we really want to make this public? How far are we willing to go? "Captain Walker," the older man began cautiously, "I want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously. However, we also need to consider the impact this could have on the department's reputation." "Don't," Melissa interrupted, her voice icy. "Don't talk to me about reputation. My daughter was handcuffed and humiliated because of the color of her skin. Your officers treated her like a suspect without cause, and if you think I'm going to let that slide to protect anyone's reputation, you're mistaken." The silence in the room was deafening. Melissa leaned forward, her eyes locking onto each of the investigators. "I've spent my career fighting for justice. I've defended this department when it deserved defending, and I've held it accountable when it didn't. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every child who has ever been profiled, every family that has suffered because someone in a uniform decided they didn't belong." The younger investigator shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Melissa didn't stop. "This is going to be a public investigation. I've already spoken with the mayor's office and local media. The community will know exactly what happened, and they'll know how this department responds." The investigators exchanged glances, realizing they had little choice but to proceed on Melissa's terms. By the time they left the conference room, Melissa's phone was already buzzing with messages. The story had started spreading. Social media posts, local news outlets, and civil rights organizations picking up on the incident. Video recordings from the scene were circulating, fueling public outrage. Activists were organizing protests, and community leaders were demanding accountability. Aaliyah clutched her mother's hand tightly as they made their way through the bustling station. She could feel the tension in the air, the way officers and staff whispered among themselves as they passed. Some looked at her with pity, others with resentment. But Melissa held her head high, unbothered by the stares. She had faced tougher battles before, and she wasn't about to back down now. That evening, Melissa held a press conference on the steps of City Hall. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and reporters jostled for position as she stepped up to the podium. Aaliyah stood beside her, nervous but determined, knowing that her mother's words would shape the narrative from here on out. "Good evening," Melissa began, her voice steady and clear. "Yesterday, my daughter, Aaliyah Walker, was unlawfully detained by officers who assumed she was involved in a theft based solely on her appearance. This incident is a stark reminder of the systemic bias that still exists within our law enforcement, and it is unacceptable." The crowd murmured in agreement, and cameras clicked furiously as Melissa continued. "I stand here today not only as a mother, but as the captain of this city's police department. I want to make one thing very clear. We are launching a full investigation into the actions of the officers involved. This will be a transparent process, and there will be accountability." She glanced at Aaliyah, giving her a reassuring nod. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about making sure no child, no person, has to go through what my daughter experienced. We owe it to our community to do better." The applause from the crowd was immediate, a wave of support that washed over both mother and daughter. But Melissa knew that this was only the beginning. The real work, changing the culture of the department, was still ahead. In the days that followed, the investigation gained momentum. Officer Owens was placed on administrative leave, and community members began sharing their own stories of racial profiling. The department faced mounting pressure to implement reforms, including mandatory bias training and the establishment of a civilian oversight board, both of which Melissa had demanded from the start. At home, Aaliyah struggled with the emotional aftermath of the incident. There were moments when she felt small and invisible, as if the weight of the world's expectations was too much to bear. But each time those feelings crept in, her mother was there, reminding her of her worth and her strength. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for being who you are," Melissa told her one evening, sitting beside her on the couch. "What happened to you was wrong, but you did nothing wrong. And now we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Aaliyah nodded, feeling a flicker of hope reignite within her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with her mother by her side, she felt ready to face it. The weeks turned into months, and the investigation concluded with a formal apology from the police department and new policies aimed at preventing future incidents. Officer Owens resigned before disciplinary action could be taken, but Melissa made it clear that the fight for justice was far from over. Aaliyah began speaking at local events, sharing her story with other young people and encouraging them to stand up against injustice. Each time she spoke, she felt stronger, more empowered, and more certain that her voice mattered. And through it all, Melissa remained her fiercest advocate, proving that justice wasn't just about what happened in courtrooms or police stations. It was about making sure every child, every person, felt seen and valued. On a quiet evening, months later, Melissa and Aaliyah sat together on their back porch, watching the stars overhead. The night was peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after a storm has passed. "I'm proud of you, baby," Melissa said softly, wrapping her arm around Aaliyah's shoulders. "You stood up, and you made a difference." Aaliyah smiled, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I couldn't have done it without you." Melissa kissed the top of her daughter's head. "We did this together, and we'll keep fighting no matter what." As the stars twinkled above them, mother and daughter sat in silence, knowing that while the road ahead was long, they would face it together, ready for whatever came next. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more of these exciting stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have a lot of new videos ahead that will definitely keep you entertained. Click on the bell to not miss the latest releases, and be sure to check out our other stories. Each of them is unique and full of emotions. See you in the next video.